Welcome to The Point of View. This is your favorite current affairs show on television. Here on The Point of View, we get the right guest, ask them relevant questions on issues that matter to you. We have a big show for you tonight with two of Africa's leading thinkers on finance and leadership. We are here at the sidelines of the Badia Arab Africa Forum, and I'll be speaking to Professor Pat Utomi, who is a leadership and economist expert, and I also have Rene Awambeng, who is the CEO of Premier Invest, as we talk about unlocking Africa's finance for development, as well as powering the continent's future. Stay with us. Welcome back. So tonight, I'm very privileged to have two men, very similar, but also very different. One is from Nigeria, the other is from Cameroon, but they're both global citizens. They live and work all over the world. Professor Pat Utomi is the closest you can get to a polymath because he's into leadership, training, he's an economist, he's also a finance man. He has lots of strong ideas on how Africa can develop. He has ideas on trade, productivity, and all of those things. Prof. Pat Utomi spoke on a panel I moderated earlier today, and I'm happy to have him join for an exclusive. Prof, thanks for joining us.
It's a great pleasure.
We're also very happy to have for the first time on The Point of View and on our channels, Mr. Rene Awambeng, who's originally from Cameroon, but as I said, lives all over the world, now in Dubai. He's been raising capital for the continent. He's been helping companies and businesses get the needed impetus to really bring transformation. And Rene, I'm sure you'll tell us more about yourself as we continue. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you. It's my pleasure to be here.
Wonderful. It's funny how Ghana, Nigeria, and Cameroon are on the same panel. But let me start with Prof. Pat Utomi. You come to Ghana a lot of times. Why did you agree to be at this Badia program in the first place?
Well, first of all, I have a role as chairman of the Private Sector Pan-African Trade and Investment Committee, which Afrexim essentially gave impetus to, but it's supposed to be a source of policy input to heads of state of Africa in terms of trade and investment decisions. So we had to come here to make input into the AU Summit.
Wonderful. And what about you, Monsieur Awambeng? What's your role at this conference?
Well, I'm a passionate Pan-Africanist, so it will be very unusual for the African Union and Badia to be celebrating its 50th anniversary without me being here. So they were kind enough to extend me an invitation to join them in Accra, Ghana, which has become the financial hub of our continent, to celebrate not only the 30 years, but to examine key developmental issues which are facing the continent at this time.
How critical is development finance in unlocking the potential of the continent?
I mean, finance, first of all, is very critical. But you need to look at the ecosystem of financial institutions. If you go to the very local level, you have got microfinance institutions. Then you have commercial banks. Then you have central banks. Then you have development financial institutions, be they bilateral or multilateral. Now, development financial institutions play a very critical role in helping to drive development across, whether it's facilitation, whether it's financing of development. And development is heavy lifting. Development means that you put in place human capital, you put in place financial infrastructure, you put in place physical infrastructure. That physical infrastructure may be roads, railways, seaports, airports, hospitals, which facilitate and drive trade. Now, development financing partners in Africa today are critically around 10 key financial institutions, which are led primarily by the African Development Bank and probably African Export-Import Bank, the African Finance Corporation, the Development Bank of the DBSA from South Africa, IDC from South Africa, TDB from East Africa, Shelter Africa, and other financial institutions which I cannot name here. These development banks, working with some of their partners like Badia, are doing a significant role in unlocking development in the continent. They bring long-term financing, they bring patient capital, They bring concessional blended financing, which comes at a cost. However, this development finance still today doesn't meet the challenge of financing the burden of Africa's infrastructure. It complements, but it doesn't meet that need. That is why we see the continent still struggling at various levels. Every year, particularly in the last couple of years, we've seen interest rates on the rise.
Yeah.
We've seen inflation on the rise. We've seen demand for development and infrastructure on the rise, but we don't have the available resources to be able to match that. So there is a conundrum for decision makers, for policy makers, how to support that development. And the common man on the street is only seeing that bread that he was buying yesterday at 10 cedi, that bread now is now 20 cedi or 100 cedi. Fuel to put in his kerosene, to put in his lamp or in his car was 100 cedi, now that is 100,000 cedi. How does this work now? This is where the issue of productivity, which you raised, and competitiveness comes in. We need to work, first of all, as Africans, to start consuming what we produce so that we reduce that import burden. We need to drive agricultural production. We need to aggregate our agricultural production to take care of other communities that cannot fend for themselves. Something just happened outside there. We met a lady who says that she's exporting grain, maize from Ghana here. Do you know that now, in my firm, Premier Invest, we are working to support an African sovereign to import grain from Eastern Europe because of the drought that is in Southern Africa. So that means that even when we talk about intra-African trade, there is a gap of knowledge about who is producing what here and who is producing what there. So that country will go ahead and import for millions of dollars grain, which they could have sourced probably from Ghana, because there's lack of trade information. Now, you don't see how that impacts development finance, because resources that could have been applied to do something else around the heavy lifting are now being spent now to get agricultural production. So you see how that linkage is. And when you put that on the scale of all of Africa and the 55 countries around the continent, you see the magnitude of that scale and the magnitude of that problem.
You've given us a lot to think about in your opening thoughts. Let me bring Prof in. But you said that we don't need PT capital, but you also said, as Africans, because Africa is the future, Africa needs investment, both from within and without, and that the future of the world depends on investment in Africa. I want you to use that in your entry into the conversation around development finance.
I'm going to come into it, but it's important to make the point of what's finance anyway. It's a very simple thing. In this world, there are people who have savings. They have more money available than they need to use. Okay, and it can be sitting there doing nothing. So this is a capital surplus area. There are people who have great ideas that can turn things into greater value, but they don't have that money sitting around. So if you can efficiently take it from these people, make it available to these people, that your intervention increases the wealth for all of society and progress does take place. So the question is, how do we organize this in a way that the desire that society has to make progress does come about? Now, what we find, unfortunately, is that in Africa, we don't do this efficiently enough. First of all, there's the impression that there's no money available to use to develop. So we need to be helped from outside. World Bank, IMF, who please come and help us. And they then look at us with pity. Okay, we give you this out of pity. It's not pity because they're killing us.
Yeah.
You know, the American economist Joseph Stiglitz, many years ago, wrote this book, Globalization and Its Discontents. And his prime thrust was to say, wait a minute, IMF World Bank, you're not doing exactly what was agreed in Bretton Woods. You have made yourself debt collector for financial institutions that made wrong decisions. You're not a debt collector. You're supposed to ensure, yes, setting financial stability in the global system, but these banks, they wanted to recycle petrodollars, and so they force, literally, encourage African countries to come and borrow monies that they couldn't pay, and then now you say they're in trouble, you get the IMF to put pressure on them. So that's not what IMF and co were set up to do. Very important point to make there. Took bad risks, should pay the price of it and move on, but IMF prevents them from paying that price. Now, but they then go about and treat it like we need pity. No. The reason that I think Africa should be taken seriously in terms of financing, both from within and from abroad, is that we live in a transiting global order. See, we have aging continents. Europe is aging, they're not having children. Asia is, America is. A continent that is producing the young that can keep this planet going is Africa. That young needs investment in them so that they can move from statistics to human capital. And when they transform from statistics to human capital, they essentially provide a demographic dividend to the continent. So the business of capturing that demographic dividend is a profitable business. There's no pity involved in it. It is pure, straight, good business. So let's approach that good business with good sense. And in doing that, I think that it can be win-win for everybody. So that's why we say, don't think pity or pity capital. Yes, think patient capital.
Wonderful.
Like Rene was saying, because you don't give people loans that you ask for 30% interest and expect them to take fundamental investment challenge decisions.
Right.
Look, greenfields, for example, anytime you apply for a loan, they say, we don't do greenfields. We don't do greenfield. So they just want you to come, you're running an operation, they just put some money, take away the profit, and nothing. When you are in Africa's position, 90% of your real serious projects are greenfield. So who is going to finance it? That's why you need development finance institutions. And they too need to understand what it really takes to take ideas, to take human capital, transform their ideas into value for society.
Wonderful. Let's deal with two themes that have come out of this. So Rene gave us the 4 levels: microfinance, commercial banks, central banks, development finance. But I think his main point was that in terms of quantity of capital, it's not enough to meet the developmental need. And then he also alludes to quality in terms of the efficiency of the institution and allocation and all of that thing. Let's deal with the quantity question first. So it appears there isn't enough capital here, which is why we go to the West or the Middle East or Asia for capital. Yet again in the panel, you alluded to the fact that, look, if we could find a way of institutionalizing what we have, whether it's land or buildings or kiosks, we could unlock more capital.
Yeah.
So I wanted you to deal with the question of the available capital and Hernando de Soto for me, and then I'll come to you on the quality of the institution in their intermediation role.
Yes. Now, this is so important because, again, the impression is often created that we are so fundamentally weak, we don't have any capital. But what is capital? Where did it come from? Why is it that the average person in America has easier access to capital, or in Europe? A Peruvian economist called Hernando de Soto has spoken very stoutly to this subject. It is you. Poor third world countries are very, very asset rich, but their assets come to debt capital. Why is it so? Because institutional development is such that those assets do not take on a fungible value, whereas in the West, it's easily so. A person starting a business in Europe or North America takes a second mortgage on his house, for example. The land that his great-grandfather left him in the middle of Minnesota has this value. Everybody knows that. He can go to a bank and use it as security to borrow money to start a business. In Africa, the average person who may have all this ancestral land, the banks completely discount it as amounting to nothing. So he cannot access that loan to start a business. This disadvantage, compounded by the fact of, Africa is too risky, so the price facilities going to Africa so high that this person who doesn't have security also has to deal with a more expensive facility. If our governments can listen and work a little hard, and the development finance institutions work with them to create these representational systems, where there is a land registry for example, that captures every land in Ghana, and whatever your grandfather left you near Kumasi, you can actually trade it.
Yeah.
And because the fact it is tradable, you can borrow against it and start a venture in which you know that you can add value that will lead you to extracting profit to pay off that loan and get wealthier and do even more things. This is a challenge that we typically face. There might be some things that are of huge investment natures that you may need raw cash capital, so to speak, to come from abroad. But you can leverage local assets to reduce the cost of that coming. My favorite example, even at the government level, I'm a very big critic of the governments of my country, Nigeria, because I don't know what it is that made the economics a very bad thing. But you see, we have institutions like the Nigerian National Petroleum Company, NNPC.
Yeah.
They drain rather than value. And because there's an example you can show.
Yeah.
Many years ago, people like me argued that we should not, in fact, I have a book I wrote in the 90s titled Managing Uncertainty, Competition and Strategy in Emerging Economies. And I interviewed, as I was writing the book, the immediate past chief executive of the NNPC. I said to him, Dr. John, his name was Thomas John. I said, Dr. John, wouldn't it make sense to privatize the NNPC? And if we had the NNPC quoted in the London Stock Exchange, for example, if Nigeria needs money, it can take 2% of the stock of NNPC in the London Stock Exchange and use it to monetize. Absolutely. Leverage some loan to come and all of that. He looked at me very mischievously for 1 minute and said, what do you mean privatize NNPC? Is it not privatized already? I said, oh, I think I missed it. He said, yes, NNPC has always been privatized. The problem is that those who own it did not pay for it. But anyway, out of the pressure that some of us made, I think, or good fortune, the grace of God intervening, an NNPC subsidiary that had stalled and fumbled and suddenly got into a position where the government now had 49% of the shares, and Shell and others had 51%. The NLNG, Nigerian Liquefied Natural Gas Project. This is the most profitable enterprise in Nigeria today.
Wow.
It is probably one of the most profitable companies in Africa. And you know, they are even so mischievous that they fail to report the dividends paid by the company. They even prevented the finance minister from going there so that she doesn't know what dividends that they are paying to the government. I say that if you take NLNG and list it in New York, London, and just took 2-3% of that, you would deal with a good part of the financial crisis Nigeria is dealing with now.
Wow.
But I don't know where they study the economics. That's what I keep saying.
Wonderful. Really, let me come to you on the quality of financial institutions in their financial intermediation, because he hinted things around high risk premium that is placed on Africa when we borrow from abroad of all kinds. And then also the high interest rates that make it difficult for money to leave those who have excess of it to those who need it. So it appears there needs to be some work done around the financial institutions and their ability to really do intermediation in a way that will unlock capital to private businesses. But also some institutional arrangement needs to be put in place so that the risk premium that international capital places on Africa is reduced. Can you give me some insight into that?
So, first of all, what are banks? Banks are regulated institutions that take deposits and make credits.
Yes.
They lend money.
Yes.
Okay? So, in fact, they are doing arbitrage.
True.
Okay? Now, deposits, where do they come from? They're your savings.
Yes,
Me and
savings.
you are savings.
Yes.
Right? Plus whatever capital that those banks have, that is their base.
Yeah.
Then they lend. So we need to drive savings, which is what I call resource mobilization. We need to drive strengthening of capital of banks. The first thing is that only until recently have our central banks reinforced that notion that bank capital base must go up. Before, because financial institutions were largely owned by single individuals or by politicians who influence policy, the threshold for capitalization of financial institutions was very low, which means that their capacity to intermediate was also very, very not strong. Again, you need to look at something. All the development finance institutions, who owns them? Principally, the governments. So if I'm a minister of finance of Ghana, all the development finance institutions are coming to me, including Development Bank of Ghana, and saying to me that, Charlie, I need to increase capital. So he needs to go to Parliament
To get money.
and go and defend a line that calls capital increase for 15 institutions who are all saying that they want to develop Ghana. The same target, build the same power stations, build the same road, build the same hospitals. We need to rationalize our resources and funnel them to those development institutions so that they can leverage with international partners and to be able to support the development challenge on the continent. I think that, and this may be controversial, there are too many institutions doing the same thing but not doing it efficiently. There needs to be some rationalization to gain efficiency and economies of scale.
So even at the continental level.
At the continental level, I've just given you the example. Call any minister of finance. One of his burdens is funding DFIs.
Yes.
He has to fund them because he is the principal owner. Every finance minister signs the treaties of these institutions and needs to fund them. That's the principal source before they can go to their fundraising activities of raising bonds, raising other issues. The basis is their capital. Now, then they have processes. Whether you start from environmental to trade development impact in making that facility. And those processes, some of the times, can go for 2 years. Now, you have DFI-A, DFI-B, all trying to build Lagos-Abidjan Highway. Then they are running different processes. Where is the efficiency? And the paymaster is the Minister of Finance of Nigeria and the Minister of Finance of Ghana, who actually owns both institutions. So there must be some form of rationalization. That is why I welcome the initiative of this Badea African Trade Bridge. And we hope that it will not only be in pooling resources together, but it will also be in pooling the approach the process, the identification of projects, and that's why in my presentation I said that we need impactful cross-border projects.
Yeah.
One cannot support, but if they come together, they can do it. There's one forum called the Africa Infrastructure Forum. I believe in that forum, that it could be a forum where all these DFIs and the commercial banks could actually work together to help to unlock Africa's projects, because we do not have unlimited resources.
Yes.
So we have to rationalize the resources that we have to support the burden of the cost of development. Then you have the other factors that are inhibiting us. Let's take them one by one. Unfortunately, we're a fragmented continent where we have more than 38 different currencies, and we have a fragmented payment system. Yes. I'm sure that before Pat came here, he had to pay his air ticket from Lagos to Accra in US dollars.
Unfortunately, I came from Washington.
Okay. You came from Washington.
Yeah.
But my friend from Tetracor, who was on the panel, paid a ticket in US dollar to fly from Lagos to Accra. What is US dollars business in a man's travel? For 2 hours or 45 minutes
from Lagos to Accra.
To come to Accra. Yes. It is the same thing in the financial infrastructure. If a Ghanaian bank wants to buy from a Angolan company, you know what happens? That Ghanaian bank here debits that customer's account, send it to
London.
A guy in London, an institution there. Yeah. That institution now looks, it says, do I know anybody in that has anybody in Portugal? They go and find their friend in New York who has another correspondent.
SWIFT system.
They have a correspondent in Portugal. Yes. Then before he finds a correspondent in Angola to send them. So inefficiency again of time, inefficiency again of cost. Again,
although I need to point out that there's something they call the Pan-African Payment and Settlement System.
Perhaps I'm coming there. And my appeal here is for African sovereigns, African corporates, African financial institutions to support our own systems and payment platforms. Because that is what will help us to bring down these costs. The other challenge that we have again, which is affecting the cost of credit, is what we call ratings. So if Ghana wants to do, in fact, if any African sovereign wants to raise money from international markets, they start by saying that, what is your investment grade? So they have a class. Some people are sitting in that class, they are called AAA. Some people are called BBB. Some people are called CCC. When you are CCC, they say you are junk grade.
Yes.
So you are not worth anything. Unfortunately, some of our cousins who have got a different body texture have CCC or BBB, but still attract better rates in the markets than African sovereigns or African corporates who go to borrow. We need to have an approach to the African risk perception. The same way, even when it comes to the media, we need to have an approach to the African reporting of news stories on our own continent. We need to tell our story differently. Now, those factors will help in to make sure that investors can really appreciate the real cost of risk. The real investors who understand this continent are making money, but they're not talking. And they don't make their decisions based on anybody's risk analysis that is signed off by a credit rating agency. But they're making triple-digit returns on this continent. So, back to my fundamental point, we need to strengthen our institutions. We need to mobilize our resources, and even some of our public sector and private sector institutions are corporate. If you go and take our sovereign wealth funds, you take our pension funds, you take our central banks, they still take their resources because of Bretton Woods institution constraints and keep in banks or institutions that don't support their own development. They say they call reserves, that you must keep a certain amount of a reserve in certain institutions. Then you are sitting here, you go to those institutions and say that we cannot afford to build hospitals, we cannot afford to build roads. They tell you that no, you cannot use that money because of this. So again, we need to find solutions to make sure that how we use that money either to strengthen our institutions or fund our own development.
This is still The Point of View. Tonight we're discussing financing Africa's development, empowering the continent's development with Professor Pat Utomi, as well as Mr. Rene Awambeng. When we come back, we'll deal with more issues around competitiveness and productivity and leadership. Stay with us. Welcome back. This is The Point of View. Tonight's edition is a special edition. We're coming to you on the sidelines of the Badia Prosperity Partnership. This is really a conversation around Arab-Africa cooperation and launching the Arab-Africa Financial Consortium. But our focus on this program is unlocking the right kind of development finance for Africa. And I have a development finance guru who's the founder of Premier Invest. He's worked, he did Afrexim Bank for many years. You can call him a finance champion for Africa, Rene Awambeng. Thank you for staying with us. And also Professor Pat Utomi, who's, he's everything, leadership, economics, law. You wanted to make a quick comment around this?
Yeah, I was going to say, I'm currently spending a year as a fellow and international policy scholar at the Woodrow Wilson Center in Washington, D.C. And the focus that I chose for this fellowship is sovereign wealth funds in Africa and how they impact both intra-African trade and infrastructure development to facilitate growth in the continent. And I think we're just making one of the major points about, sovereign wealth funds are supposed to be essentially taking care of the future from the savings of now. There are different kinds of models, but one very important model is future growth infrastructure. How do you finance them? When you come to a situation that you are placing most of the money outside the continent, that's good, just spreading risk and all of that. But when that then increases the cost of financing development, I wonder what the gain has come to in the end. So I think that there's a lot of rethinking of how sovereign wealth funds operate and how this kind of cooperation between African financial institutions can facilitate giving impetus to the savings of Africa, which is what sovereign wealth funds are really supposed to be about.
Wonderful. Let's talk about productivity. So the finance comes in to help us produce. And when we produce efficiently, we're able to sell cheaper so that we create wealth. And essentially, people's lives are better. The challenge we face is that most of what we produce have been things, raw materials we send abroad. So that value is added to it and is brought back here. Yet we've said we are doing Africa Continental Free Trade. There's a question around the diversification of African exports so that we can have better trade among ourselves. And then, of course, the mindsets around, I prefer a Nigerian shirt to a Chinese or an American one also comes in. So I want you to deal with the question of productivity and what trick are we missing? Maybe you want to start there.
No,
what trick are we missing?
I'm burning to talk about this.
Go ahead.
Okay.
So you want to talk about productivity and competitiveness.
Yes.
You are creating us a problem here.
Why?
You went to school, you did economics.
Yes.
What are the factors of production?
They give us 4: land, labor, capital, and enterprise. That's what they told us.
Land, labor,
Capital and enterprise.
okay. So it says that we have abundant land. We have abundant resources.
Labor.
Yes, we have abundant labor, skilled and unskilled.
Yes.
Capital,
That's the question we've been dealing with for the first 30 minutes.
resources.
Yes.
So let me talk about power. Because the critical issue which is not driving Africa's productivity is the lack of power.
Okay.
The lack of power. And I will permit myself to use examples to show you one good case and one bad case. Let us take South Africa. Can we quantify the scale of what damage the lack of energy and power has done to South Africa's economy? Can we quantify the impact which Morocco's excess power production has done to drive the impetus of that country? So take those two graphic examples.
When I come, I'll take Nigeria and Egypt.
Take those two graphic examples, and then you can see the impact of how power can transform a country. Morocco today is significantly replacing the West as a source and a hub for development in Africa. The port of Tangier is a key hub not only for intra-African, for extra-African trade. Morocco's OCP is helping to do food self-sufficiency because they are the largest producer of fertilizer, which goes to fuel agriculture. Moroccan financial institutions, all of a sudden in the last 10 years, have slowly taken over almost 1/3 of financial capacity in Central and West Africa. Moroccan companies in construction are slowly taking over civil works and construction work across Africa because they have the fundamentals right. Morocco has the right strategy around power generation, power production, power distribution, particularly renewables. So we cannot talk about productivity when we have not addressed the key issue of how do we power, because we cannot be competitive. The cost of production, if we are supposed to buy power at 50 cents instead of having power at 10 cents, will not make us competitive in the international markets. Now, the opportunity is there. The African Continental Free Trade Arrangement presents now a single market which will take us to probably 1.2 to 1.5 billion. I was reading some statistics that Nigeria and DRC will be the largest businesses. In fact, I'm going to DRC to create a new fund there, a future fund for DRC, because I believe that that is the market that is waiting to explode. The DRC for alone will be bigger than the United States as a market in the next 10 to 30 years. Okay? Now, today, if you are producing now in a country here, you don't have power, you are not aggregating, how can you be competitive? Today, if you are producing only to sell in Ghana, when the same commodity or product, is required in neighboring Niger, Burkina Faso, Mali, but you don't have the infrastructure to move it to those markets, how do you become competitive? Today, if you are producing here, you don't have the right technology, how do you compete with your peers in China? So we need to be able to take advantage of that single market, to aggregate. And this is where institutions like Afreximbank have done commendable work. Okay. Special economic zones and industrial parks are being built now across the African continent. Those special economic zones will serve as hubs for industrialization, which means that we can transform some of our commodities which are being exported in raw form today, whether it's cocoa that is being produced in Ghana, it can be transformed and then now sold on a scalable basis. You know, we had a project, unfortunately this project hasn't come to fruition, where we recommended to the governments of Ghana, Nigeria, Cameroon, not to sell their cocoa beans. To process all their cocoa beans and to now trade it so that they can get the value here in Africa. Do you know why we cannot do that? Because they say for phytosanitary reasons, the processed beans here, the liquor, cannot meet their standards. So we even tried to cut it around, and we wanted to create an African company in Latvia, where we could take advantage of shipping it to Latvia, or processing it there, and selling back to the world market. China, Russia, and the Europe being one of the largest markets where the chocolate are, to be able to improve our productivity and improve our efficiency. Fortunately, that kind of project has not worked. But these are the kinds of initiatives that we need as Africans to make that change.
So we can't do it as individuals. We need to work together.
We need to work together. If you take even textiles, we are very good in cotton producing. Ghana, Togo, Benin, Burkina Faso, Niger, Nigeria, all these countries produce cotton. But do we have a textile industry?
No.
Because we don't have that processing capacity. That raw cotton is found somewhere, and then so we are not competitive globally. We are not.
So you've dealt with two issues, power and aggregation. I want him to have a brief take on power and elaborate on aggregation.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. There is just so much to deal with when you come to this challenge of competitiveness. Clearly, he hit on power, which is so important. We have often neglected to focus appropriately on power. And I tell you how the Nigerian case is so tragic. Today, Nigeria is still struggling with 3,000 or 4,000 megawatts of power. I mean, probably less than we were at a decade, 2 decades ago. It seems to like go and then fall. Why? Well, of course, there's a problem of planning, there's a problem of corruption, there are all kinds of things. But not having the mindset to understand that power is central to production is tragic. And it has held down development in Nigeria for such a long time. Compare with Egypt, and he's given the Morocco example, which I particularly love. I've visited Morocco not long ago, visited the ports at Tangier and all of that. You know, what is strange is that we're trying to create African hubs for stuff. And there is more, from the port of Tangier, you can swim across to Europe, and it's becoming a hub. Whereas a place like Accra or Lagos can be more natural a hub. But because they have done a few things right, it's enabling them to be more competitive relative to people who are even better geographically located. So we need to deal with the fundamental power issue.
Okay.
Look at how Egypt has increased its own power in a short period of time. Egypt and Nigeria both went to Siemens on with the same goal. Egypt said, we don't have money, you borrow against sovereign guarantees. Boom! Egypt has 20, 30 thousand more megawatts of power. Nigeria is still waiting, where it gave billions to Siemens. It just shows the kinds of problems we have in structuring things that are fundamental to our economic growth on the continent. For us to be able to become more competitive, not only do we have to have power, I mean, Egypt's strategy says they must always have at least 10,000 megawatts more than their need at any point in time.
Wow.
And that's what they're planning towards. And of course, you know how far Nigeria is from its need right now. But we also need education, education, and education. It is the human capital that facilitates productivity increase that drives the competitiveness. And again, I will come back to this, we need a strategy. You can't do everything as well. So you got to choose areas where you have certain factor endowments and you use limited industrial policy to facilitate great efficiencies within those factors to make you competitive on those value chains. So if I'm going to deal with Nigeria, I'm not going to go back to import substitution industrial strategy and go for these big tariff barriers or my friend who writes about what's the thing from the Bible about Chang, Heju Chang in Oxford.
Chang, yes.
Yes, Bad Samaritans.
Yes, Bad
So,
Samaritans.
you know, you need to really close. No. That creates problems of competitiveness. I say just take a limited, and this is where Justin Lin argues very strongly, take a limited number of your endowments. Say, on this, here's an industrial policy that will enable us to compete. So you're looking at Ghana next door, and you're looking at what you can exchange between Nigeria and Ghana. So let's take that area, compete thoroughly from Ghana. Nigeria, Ghana work together and become dominant in, say, one value chain. We need to have that kind of thinking to raise productivity on the continent. First of all, because our countries are so fragmented, you know, colonialism and all of that, we need to ourselves break those barriers, aggregate across borders, get the appropriate inputs like power, human capital, and all of that, and cooperate.
But the last point you make, our countries are fragmented. We are not the only fragmented countries in the world. We might have a checkered history, but we are not the only fragmented countries. Europe itself is fragmented. But because they have commonized, unitized a number of things within their union, like infrastructure, it makes it easier. Okay? Latin America is also fragmented. Because they're standardized a number of things, it makes it easier for them to be more competitive than us. I really cannot think of one single product that we as a continent produce on a global scale that stands us out competitively with the rest of the world.
That's why we're 3%
It is time for us to start picking things that we can manage, control, and be competitive. Those things are there. We have our agricultural products, which we can pick, whether it's even timber. We have cocoa, we have coffee, we have cashew nuts, which we can focus on those things. We can develop them, process them, and make them competitive points globally.
You just mentioned something that gets me going. Do you know Vietnamese of yesterday? They started industrializing yesterday. People from Vietnam descend on Nigeria and Ghana during a certain period of the year between, say, April
to come and buy your cashew.
Buy cashew
and go and
ship it and process it in Vietnam and ship it back.
Serious. I'll end with leadership, 2 minutes each. When we come back, this is the point of view. Tonight is really into the Africa question. We've dealt with financing our development. We've also passed the corridor of powering our development, being more competitive. But at the base of all of this is quality, ethical leadership. I'll ask my panel to deal with that in a minute each. When we come back, stay with us. Welcome back. So tonight is a big one, Africa's development, financing it, powering it. But at the base of all of that, I'm sure my panel will agree, is leadership. I'm still talking to Professor Patutomi and Renee Awambeng. Let me start with Renee on the question of leadership, because all the things you say, they seem very obvious. But you said something in the panel that implementation is the issue. It's not the lack of ideas. So what's your concluding thought around how to convert all of these great ideas into action? And what's the role of leadership in all of this?
No, leadership is very key. Leadership is very key, but we need to look at our history as a continent and where this positions itself. We first of all have to thank, and let me go back. Africa again is a young continent when it comes to our independence. Yes. Okay, we have a long history, but we're a young continent. So we first of all have to thank our forefathers who fought the political leadership fight of getting us emancipation and providing us with our independence. Then the leadership that they had at that time was political independence. The leadership we need now is our economic independence. And that is where we have what I would say gaps. That is where we have gaps. Our leaders collectively need to focus on the economic emancipation, the economic liberation of our continent. And leadership is collective on the African scale. Whether it's political leaders, business leaders, they need to come together with one strength, with one common vision to be able to work together on these issues that we have discussed to find the right solutions. Certainly there are different leadership styles. Certainly there are differences. But the focus we need to look at, if you look at averagely, it is 55 going to 60, all African countries, right? So for the first 50 years or 40 years, they fought the battle of political independence we have now. The focus for the next 20 to 30 years needs to be on the economic emancipation of Africa. But we need to rethink how we want that economic emancipation, how we can empower every African to come out of poverty. And they need to be worried of something, the youth. The youth, they don't pay attention to that youth. that youth is the one who is going to provide that leadership. Technology. They don't pay attention to the youth and technology. The youth and technology combined together will be the future leaders of Africa.
That's powerful. Yeah. I'll give you a closing word.
Yeah, well, thank you. You know, we talk about leadership as a problem in Africa, and you ask, really, what do leaders do? First of all, it's important to recognize that values shape human progress. Okay, Jared Diamond makes a profound point of this in his famous book, Collapse, in which he shows that all through human history, values has been the reason for the collapse of societies, preventing them from making the progress they could have made. So what do leaders do? A lot of grammar is spoken about leadership. I've written books on leadership. Fundamentally, the most important things that leaders do is shape culture. And culture determines human progress. What we have that challenges us in Africa is that many people who seek leadership position forget that the purpose of leadership is immortality. And then they trade it for personal convenience in this narcissism that dominates play in politics in Africa. And we find, therefore, that we trip on ourselves and don't get where we should be going. Leadership is other-centered behavior. But many people who come into leadership position in Africa think first of themselves. Once you think primarily of yourself, you're not a leader. A leader thinks of others first. Once we can get that going in Africa, we're going to make incredible progress.
Wow. Professor Pat Utomi and Rene Awambeng, two thought leaders on the continent, really doing great work on various aspects of our development. We've been talking to them at the sidelines of the Badia Prosperity Partnership here in Accra, and we've been discussing the issue of unlocking development finance for the continent, powering our finance, ending on the imperative of leadership. Thank you for watching tonight's edition of the show. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.